The Stanley Parable 2 makes fun of the incessant need for things to do by adding in a bunch of fluff content. The game adds in collectibles that have no value. This parodies the completionist culture of video games, but also intentionally draws a parallel between neoliberal office culture logic and completionism in games, suggesting that collectibles condition people towards the same obsessive numbers must go up mentality that marks neoliberal capitalism. In other words, the game parodies the way in which games condition players to think like capitalists, by giving you exactly what you want, but highlighting its futility and lack of deeper value to the player's experience. The game also extends this joke into the infinite hole, an ending which is designed to parody the need for games to have excitement and infinite playability and replayability. Games are designed to keep you playing forever, and the idea of the infinite hole is that it's the most boring possible version of this, and it also serves as a visual pun too, because the games themselves are a sort of infinite hole, in the sense that they prompt players to sink large amounts of time into experiences that have nothing of value for them. Playing Call of Duty might feel more rewarding, but at its base level, it is no more meaningful to a player's life than just simply falling down a hole forever until you get bored. The infinite hole ending even offers a number of more interesting aesthetic and gameplay options than the base game of the Stanley Parable, in order to make doing absolutely nothing really exciting, but as a joke, where it emphasizes even more that you are doing literally nothing. This is true when you play games. While you may be typing away at a keyboard or tapping away at a controller, other than bearing witness to the media, you are physically doing nothing, and for many games, emotionally and mentally doing nothing too. They are a means of sinking deeper into a layer of only semi-consciousness, and the infinite hole ending mocks this by having these weird diversions be delusions due to Stanley's own inability to remain interested in an experience that is mundane. At the same time, the infinite hole ending satirizes the demand for constant stimulation in contemporary media, particularly video games, though I'd argue the same critique can easily be applied to social media as well. Because we need constant stimulation and can't just exist for a bit, we seek out games and media that give us a more thrilling experience. But that thrilling experience is sitting in a chair dissociating from our lives to be stimulated by a bunch of sights and sounds that are often exciting, but almost just as often totally meaningless to our lives outside of the game. As someone who has been outspoken in wanting his game to have value to players outside of just the act of playing it, Reedon clearly puts a lot of emphasis here on how a lack of traditional features that are staples of the neoliberal logic of commodifying art is what makes the Stanley Parable a game that a lot of players typically reject. And so by giving these people what they want in a context that emphasizes how meaningless what they really want is, it serves to make a point that the games themselves are often just giving people the illusion of something of value. Ultra Deluxe continues to parody the meaningless editions of deluxe editions of games, and the need to pad out content in order to keep players engaged and spending time and money on games that otherwise offer the same experience over and over again with the reassurance bucket. An entire game hides within the reassurance bucket, which when Stanley picks up and goes through the base game, causes the base game to be significantly altered in its contents. Each ending now has a new variation of dialogue and even of the outcome altogether. The result is all these slightly modified versions of the original stories, and while some of them are remarkably different from their original iteration, the tying thread for them is that the basic experience is still largely the same, and so the only reason to really go through these endings is to see the new content. And that obsession with needing new content and needing to consume every last thing you can think of is part of what the original game was parodying, but brought to a head here. The game emphasizes how exhaustingly addictive the completionist mentality is, and how ultimately it yields no valuable results. Now, if we want to examine the reassurance bucket, it will be a little bit difficult because the original game's endings all make varying points about corporate culture and about games, but the new endings don't quite do the same. Instead, the bucket endings are a series of absurdist jokes that play off of the player's prior knowledge of the base game, and how these endings will be altered in strange ways by the presence of just a random bucket. For example, the museum ending, which originally was a museum to the Stanley Parable that reflected a sort of existential meaninglessness to being a fictional character, while also providing behind-the-scenes looks at the creative process for the game, allowing the players to see a bit into the motivating decisions behind their experience directly while playing the game, instead becomes a museum dedicated to the bucket. This is, of course, funny, but it doesn't really make much of a point about the nature of gaming or the nature of what it means to be a person or anything to do with corporate culture. In fact, no ending with the bucket is substantially impressive with a point being made. However, all of them collectively do make a point, which is the ease with which one simple, meaningless alteration to the narrative can become so substantial. The bucket has its importance inflated in the narrative as a joke. It's a pretty obvious joke too, it's literally just a bucket. This is, in part, reminiscent of the companion cube in Portal. Let's talk about the companion cube for a bit. When playing the original Portal, it might not be apparent what the joke of the companion cube is. I'm sure many people can figure it out, but the game came out when I was 13 and I didn't quite get the joke at the time. In fact, not getting the joke revealed a sort of dual nature to the joke that helped me understand it better once I connected the dots. The companion cube is just a cube. It is an object that we have used many times before and will use again. But the game gives it this sense of increased significance, as if we will naturally, inevitably become obsessed with the cube. The only thing that makes the companion cube different is that it has a little heart on it, and that it appears to be singing some kind of melody when you listen closely. Those differences give it a warmth and personality that the other cubes don't have. And apart from GLaDOS, the only other characters we experience in Portal are turrets that are trained to kill on sight. So for the test subjects, there is a remarkable lack of allies or friendliness or companionship. So the companion cube is, for the first time in the game and presumably for the first time in test subject experience, a source of comfort. The joke of the companion cube is that test subjects have become so paranoid, exhausted, traumatized, and isolated that they grow obsessed with it because it's the only source of comfort they have in a situation where they are basically being tortured and killed. The joke is that people develop an insane attachment to it because it offers this surface level of positivity that they have otherwise been so deprived of that they begin to ascribe transcendent qualities to this positivity. Portal is kind of commenting on industry culture in this regard, the companion cube being a prelude to the Amazon quiet boxes, a source of comfort from a power structure that is innately oppressive, with said source of comfort being both allotted from that power structure and designed to reinforce it. In other words, the companion cube is, in part, meant to drive people insane, by reminding them that they still have feelings before forcing them to destroy the one thing that gives them comfort. It is meant as a form of psychological torture. The reassurance bucket is, no doubt in my mind, inspired in part by the companion cube. Just as someone caught as a test subject in torturous science experiments would become overly attached to a mundane object, the reassurance bucket is a mundane object that is given weighted significance because of the deprivation of meaningful human connection that Stanley has experienced up until this point. A number of the gags about the bucket involve it having intense importance. In some endings, the bucket is sentient and can speak to Stanley. In others, Stanley is hallucinating that the bucket can speak, or maybe even hallucinating that the bucket exists at all. In others, the bucket can't speak, and the narrator questions Stanley's sanity as Stanley's sanity begins to deteriorate. In one ending, Stanley goes home and has an intense romantic relationship with the bucket that becomes cyclical as Stanley seems to lose all grip on sanity. In a similar ending, the narrator tests Stanley to see if he even knows what a bucket is, and, at least the way I played it at first, Stanley was unable to tell buckets from tractors, from holograms, etc. The absurdity of the reassurance bucket is that there would be a transcendent importance ascribed to a mundane object. Specifically, buckets being an object that can easily be found in an office, but are not representative of office culture. Instead, a bucket would typically be found in a maintenance closet, or if left behind by a janitor. In the case of the latter scenario, a bucket in your office would be an anomaly because it would be a foreign object to the office culture itself. This alone takes a mundane object and describes it with a unique importance, because this is one of the strange and sort of discomforting realities of neoliberalism in the digital age. We've become so fragmented with how we convert all aspects of our lives into capital that we have distanced ourselves from the base level of living that marked our histories. Think about it this way. Back in the 1800s, you lived in a home, and in the home, people, mostly women and sometimes children, would have to do upkeep to keep the home in good shape. They would also have to sew clothes, sometimes farm their own food, etc. The actual process of sustaining an economy was more reliant on the family unit. This changed in the 20th century as assembly line production and the increased emphasis on factory production of basic needs replaced the family unit structure as a form of economic self-regulation. Instead, families became increasingly pushed out into the marketplace as both consumers and workers, in order to attain the basic needs and goods that they would be after. During the mid-20th century, a push towards the traditions of the pre-World War era led towards women being pushed back into the home to basically become forced mothers and maids. But when women pushed for more economic and legal freedoms in the second wave of feminism, America, England, and some other Western nations pushed back against this during the rise of neoliberalism by making it so that all aspects of life became oriented around capital. The result is that, for middle-class white Americans, the stay-at-home wife model got replaced by the latchkey kid model, where fathers and mothers would both be out in the workplace, and women would still be burdened with taking care of the kids and cleaning. But for more successful couples, they would outsource the work within the home to maids, babysitters, daycare centers, and others by paying for care labor. The care labor industry is a major example of how neoliberalism has shaped our basic structure of living away from what used to be taken for granted. Rather than paying for people to stay home and take care of their home, people either have to work all the time and take care of their home on their free time, thus depriving them of any leisure time, or they have to pay for other people to take care of their home so that they can afford leisure time. This would mean that if you make a decent amount of money at an office job, you might be very good at typing away at a computer, but might have very little working knowledge of how to properly maintain a car, how to carve wood, how to raise children, how to properly clean a carpet, etc. Instead, while anybody could hypothetically be good at most basic needs, nobody can do all of them, and instead, we have to rely on hiring workers and laborers to do these things for us from time to time. And so, while for a janitor, a bucket is a mundane object that is at a base level integrated into that person's work life, that would not necessarily be true for Stanley. And so the bucket being a foreign object to his world speaks to 2 points simultaneously. That the corporate lifestyle Stanley lives has become so isolating that anything that exists outside of it that he can take with him would be something to obsessively cling to, and also that Stanley's work life has become so fractured from the basic needs, wants, and skills that people should generally all have, that a bucket is reassuring because it promises something of value other than Stanley's ability to contribute to the corporate machine. If we view the reassurance bucket as analogous to the companion cube, they both sort of make the same point. Deprived of any basic human contact with the outside world, the protagonist clings obsessively to this mundane object that takes on weighted significance because of that deprivation. That deprivation is manufactured by the power structure that the protagonist belongs to in order to subject them to the whims of those with power over them. And that object of weighted significance is given to you by the power structure, and given that significance deliberately to remind you of your own oppression so that you feel only on a base level that you could ever possibly have better. In other words, the reassurance bucket is the quiet room in the Amazon warehouse. It's there to give you empty reassurance that someone cares about you while reminding you that you are less than human to those who have power over you. The Stanley Parable is intentionally an incomplete text. This is one of its most interesting qualities, but also makes it hard to discuss. After all, when you watch a movie, you more often than not get a complete text. You can watch a movie in a short space of time, and you are expected to watch the entirety of a film such as There Will Be Blood or Parasite before you can meaningfully make sense of the text as a whole. Games are generally harder to do this with. Some games are very straightforward, presenting the whole text cohesively in a short space of time. The Beginner's Guide, for example, while being a game about incomplete text, is a game that is very easy to experience as a complete package in 1 to 2 sittings. Meanwhile, a game like Metal Gear Solid 5 has so much content that getting to all of it would only be for extremely dedicated fans of the game. And so how does one review MGS5? How does one assess it as a work of art? Games are one of the least complete mediums for art in this sense. You are often not expected to access the full text of a game by the intrinsic design of the game. And yet the extrinsic motivations that are baked into the game and into the culture of gaming encourage you to try. This is where completionism comes from. This idea that you do not have the full experience of a game until you see everything in it. This converts art into a form of tourism almost. And the Stanley Parable intentionally rejects this. Not only does the Stanley Parable reject completionism, but it forces the player to confront the meaning of an incomplete experience of play and of art. What does it mean that you don't get to have an ending? The loading screen says, the end is never the end is never the end. Yes, you can technically accomplish 100% of the intended outcomes the developers left possible for players, but doing so is deliberately tedious, frustrating, and has no extrinsic motivations. This serves to comment on the culture of gaming, but also leaves one with a sense of the game not having as much value as an experience. Granted, The Beginner's Guide is my favorite game possibly ever, and so I'm almost guaranteed to find that game more fulfilling. But while that game does have a definite resolution to the narrative, it doesn't have a definitive resolution to the emotions that one experiences while going through that game's story. David Reed said of the Stanley Parable that he wanted to have a game where the complex mechanisms of play were the ones that would occur inside the player's mind, where the experience of play is primarily about what people leave with, rather than what they do inside the game. This is more true for the Beginner's Guide than for the Stanley Parable. That game is a game that primarily is a platform for a broader, open question about relationships, emotions, art, and the dynamics that emerge when all these become tangled up in one another. The Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe continues some of these themes and ties them into the original Stanley Parable game to give second thoughts to players whose feelings towards the game were influenced negatively by the game's refusal to lean into the immediate satisfaction of completionism, addicting game mechanics, or lowest common denominator humor. I don't think the game thinks of itself as self-important. The self-importance it presents itself with in the narrative is ironic. It's a joke that is meant to reflect how lame and kind of dull the Stanley Parable is as a concept. Whereas Portal is a game that satirizes elements of tech culture in video games, Portal is also a game where you have a gun that can open portals and has these really rewarding and exciting physics puzzles. Portal doesn't need to make a point to be a great game. Making a point is the only real point of the Stanley Parable. And while that can make it an interesting experience, it makes it a frustratingly limited experience as well. This is the primary gag of the Stanley Parable 2. To comment on how there's really nothing you can do to capitalize on a game that was designed around intentional mediocrity. The Stanley Parable is mediocre, and its mediocrity reveals interesting ideas and themes, but it doesn't become less mediocre to actually play. So in my assessment of the Stanley Parable, it's difficult to know when enough is enough. Did I capture enough footage? Were there secrets I missed, endings I ignored, details I left out that would complicate or conflict with or refute my interpretations of its meaning? I don't know. And while I could bother to look up everything to be excruciatingly thorough, wouldn't that sort of defeat the point of a game that does not want people to experience it in full? That completionist mentality is very neoliberal in nature. It's make the numbers go up. I certainly had a lot to say about the game, but if I decided to make a comprehensive interpretation that included every last thing in the game, it would really just reflect the gamer mentality, the neoliberal mentality, where enough can never just be enough. And I think that, as it stands, the incomplete version of the Stanley Parable I experienced is enough to reflect on a lot of its meanings. We don't need to know the totality of a text to examine it, so long as we have enough to work with that we can assume our interpretation would be compatible with the full text. Art is about what we take away, and that is far from just the text itself. Paratext, for example, is a crucial part in understanding the Stanley Parable. The game is not just a game, it's a part of a culture of gaming that it reflects on. The way people experience the Stanley Parable is as important as its contents, the way people talk about it. In fact, I don't think one can even begin to understand the Stanley Parable until you watch video essays about it, or read reviews of it, or engage with the culture surrounding it. And it's for a simple reason. The Stanley Parable is a self-reflexive postmodern game that is, in large part, about that surrounding culture. My comparisons to Half-Life, to The Matrix, to Portal, are not comparisons I make for no reason. There is nothing in the game saying directly that the Stanley Parable is in dialogue with those works, and yet to people who've experienced them alongside the Stanley Parable, the parallels I draw likely make total sense. And that's because when I played the Stanley Parable, the parallels felt really obvious, like how the reassurance bucket is a mundane object given special significance for what, at a first glance, seems to be no reason. But at the same time, Half-Life 2 and Portal 2 are both referenced directly in the text of the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, so it's undeniable that these series were substantially relevant to some of the creative processes that sparked the Stanley Parable. Given its origins as a Half-Life 2 mod, the parallels just feel too obvious not to mention. But these paratextual factors are what I bring into the game, as well as what I take away. The point of the game is not strictly to comment on Half-Life, Portal, or any other singular game. The point is to provoke players to think about games in such a way where we can find our own parallels and draw our own meanings from those parallels. It is a launchpad for our own perspectives on media. And here's the thing. All media functions the same way. The point of art is not to give a finalized statement on a given perspective. That is the point of propaganda. Propaganda is meant to end discussions, to close minds, to provoke a lack of insight on the part of its audiences. Most art, particularly art that is a labor of passion and love, will often spark conversations that connect into the bread of a broader culture. And while a lot of people are content to excise the broader culture and reflect on a text as a self-contained piece that has no meaning outside of its contents, the Stanley Parable specifically seeks to reject this mentality by calling awareness to the world outside of it. This is what a lot of postmodern art does, and this is one of the more dangerous mentalities towards art, it being a common mentality among capital G gamers. The Stanley Parable is, at its core, a game about how we've become conditioned to accept terms in which we are given empty gestures toward catharsis and escapism, while in practice simply being reduced to rats and mazes, being asked to endlessly walk through them, looking for some kind of prize or exit. This perspective draws a comparison between corporate life and the base gameplay of contemporary video games, and concludes that there is no value in continuing to exist inside of the system. The only way out is to exit the system itself. We can't exit the system while agreeing to its terms. The Stanley Parable confronts us with this by prompting us to try to do everything in the game and then be given no real meaningful way to do so, frustrating us until we recognize that at any time we can simply just quit if we are no longer enjoying the experience. The point of the Stanley Parable is not to be unenjoyable. The point is to be enjoyable, but to recondition us to recognize the futility in continuing to experience something past the point where we are invested. To have a nice time experiencing what the game has to offer, but be consciously aware that we can and should simply turn the game off the moment we don't have further investment in the experience. It's that lack of self-consciousness as we experience games that leaves us susceptible to the sort of hypnotic state that allows a lot of games to function as neoliberal propaganda. So breaking that requires breaking that hypnotic state to promote self-consciousness. The same theme emerges in Hotline Miami, and a similar theme emerges in Spec Ops: The Line, although that game is commenting on how games function as imperialist propaganda. Becoming aware not just of what is happening in a game, but in what we're doing as we play, both in regards to the experience we have while psychologically existing within the confines of the experience of play, as well as the experience we're having outside of the game as people simply sitting down and staring at a screen for hours on end, is one of the biggest takeaways of a lot of contemporary postmodern games. Half-Life wants us to forget that we're Gordon Freeman, so that we can believe that we really are Gordon Freeman, as contradictory as that may sound. The game wants us to feel as though we're in the experience, such that we forget that the character we're playing as is a different person that exists outside of ourselves. The Stanley Parable does the same thing, making the player forget that they are playing as a fictional character named Stanley, and begin to live out the experience of Stanley as if it is our own experience. But unlike Half-Life, where the goal is to indulge an exciting desire that many players have, the Stanley Parable wants a certain horror to set in about what it means to take on the life of the fictional Stanley. Stanley's life is marked by an infinite attempt to escape the mundane, dehumanizing life of his work. He never can. This is what happens as we play video games. We escape, or attempt to escape, into a million stories that are not our own to avoid confronting the fact that our story is miserable and boring. Stanley is ultimately looking for a story so that his life is not just him typing away at a keyboard forever. But by playing so many video games, we allow our life to become exactly that, typing away at a keyboard forever. There is an existential horror to neoliberalism that the Stanley Parable confronts by positioning us as the neoliberal object. What happens when there's no way out? What happens when there is no escape? This is the question our real lives can often leave us with. This is why people desperately attempt to cling to anything other than integrating into the neoliberal system. Video games are just one form of escapism among many, but crucially, no form of escapism gives us subjectivity when under a system that deprives us of it. If the starting point is one resembling Stanley's life, the outcome, no matter what it could be, will be equally meaningless. In other words, if you exist under neoliberalism, your life will never mean as much as you want it to. This may sound nihilistic, and it is, but let's think about it a different way. This nihilism is the nihilism posed to us by neoliberalism. If we accept it, if we accept that our lives are fundamentally meaningless because we exist simply to work until we die, then our options are, much like Stanley, work until we die, or just die. But that's ultimately to the advantage of the system, to get us to view our world with nothing but contempt and nihilism. There are many great things about our world. Neoliberalism doesn't rid those entirely, but makes it hard for us to remember or hold on to them for as long as we'd like. And instead, contemporary mass media fills our heads with this sense that our life needs some narrative thrust, that our lives need to be a Greek comedy or a Greek tragedy, that there must be some arc that gives our lives meaning, and without this arc, our lives are meaningless and valueless. Being conditioned to accept this is what leads those who don't find this meaning down a path towards nihilism and misanthropy. But those narratives are illusions. The alternative, that a lot of contemporary media does not allow us to explore, is that our lives do not need to fit a model. That there is nothing better or worse about having had a story to tell, about having had some grander purpose in life or not. What matters is something that makes you personally feel satisfied. And if you can't isolate personal satisfaction from cultural pressures and norms, it might be that personal satisfaction will be impossible in that state. It's the act of turning off, of avoiding the escape and just simply asking, what do I want my life to be? That is the starting point to a better experience of the world. And while many people get hung up on what their life isn't, just taking time to admire the good things about what your life is can help greatly. I speak from experience, as someone whose life would tell probably the least interesting story ever. I sat in my room, I typed away at a keyboard, and I consumed a bunch of media to escape. I'm nearing 30 now, and maybe I have some regrets about how much of my life has been destroyed by inaction. But at the same time, it allowed me to become really knowledgeable on a lot of relevant and necessary topics. It allowed me to become incredibly gifted at music and to improve my skills as a writer and academic. It allowed me the ability to work on introspection and develop an emotionally mature outlook that has helped not just me, but a lot of people close to me. That's because I see it as really important to resist the logic of oppression, which means resisting the urge to declare suffering and hardship a meaningless experience and to declare the state of affairs as fundamentally cruel. We should all think we deserve better than that. Despair or defeatist acceptance are not our only two choices. But when the time comes and you are offered only two doors to walk through, what choice do you want to make? Thanks for watching.